want you to know that there is true, profound, important research that connects what happens to you in childhood and what's happening to you today in everything from your health and relationships and well-being to your mental health. Hi, I'm Dr. Kim Sage, and I wanted to share with you some re-modified slides from one of the most important research studies that I personally believe has ever existed, and especially one that applies to everything I talk about on my channel related to attachment, relationships, our childhood, our wounds, our stories, and hopefully our healing, but also our physical health as much as our mental health. And that is the study called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Many of you, I'm sure, know all about it, but it really was a groundbreaking study of 17,000 adults, mostly college educated, mostly white, in San Diego in the 90s. And it looked at the relationship between our childhood experiences and our later adult life mental and physical health risks, diseases, everything from do we smoke more, do we drink more, do we have cancer, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease. There's a very strong connection between what happens to us in childhood and how it plays out in adult life. And that is what this video is about. So I'm going to post the slides as I talk. They were adapted from a link I'll put down below from the original researcher as he presented on this topic, but I put my Kim version into them, and I hope you will find them helpful. And I hope really validating if you are suffering with the list of CPTSD symptoms I mentioned in this video. It's very likely that the root of many of your struggles is related to your difficult childhood events. Now, those can be everything from having a, let's say, borderline or narcissistic parent to, being a victim of repeated abuse in some regard. It really can vary. And what's concerning about this research is that given the way it was set up, and I'll discuss that in a minute, it's probably likely that it has been highly underestimated our exposure to trauma and traumatic events. In fact, most of us have had at least one traumatic exposure in life, but most of us have had many, many more. And this study looked at those in adults with regard to their childhood up to the age of 18, the things that happened to them. But that is the core, is that what happens to us has a profound impact upon our health and our wellness and our dis-ease in our adult lives. So let's get started though. Before I do, please feel free to subscribe and click the bell, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. All right, so I'm going to talk about the ACE study. I'm going to talk about childhood trauma and our mental and physical health outcomes and how this really affects all of us. And so I guess your question may be, well, how does it affect all of us? It affects all of us because this research, it looks at what we think to be often people who have, a decent station in life. They were people who haven't faced a lot of racism. They were people who had, college degrees. We're not even talking about lower income, more poverty-stricken communities, places where resources are even more limited, places where there is more illness, more divorce, more hunger. It matters because it gives us a glimpse into what happens when we even have a little more advantages in life, that we're still in a place where we can struggle so much in our adult lives with our mental and physical health. So the ACE study stands for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it was the largest of its kind to ever examine the lifelong impacts of adverse childhood events among those 17,000 individuals. And the research shows that these ACEs, these 10 categories of what we're calling adverse childhood events, are very common, that they are strong predictors of our social functioning, our well-being, disease, death, and health risks. And this combo of ACEs is the leading determinant of health, social well-being, and economy of the nation. And we say economy, right? I'll get into that, but the truth is that if you are on disability because of a health issue or mental health issue, as a result of your trauma in childhood, that affects all of us. So for many reasons it affects all of us, but that's just one example. Now, how did the study begin? I think this is really fascinating, but let me just sum it up for you. These were a group of doctors at Kaiser who were trying to help people lose weight. And they had a patient who had weighed, these were obese patients. She had weighed 408 pounds. and she got down to 132 pounds in 51 weeks. So she lost 276 pounds. But within 3 weeks of this massive weight loss, she gained 36 pounds back, which is a tremendous amount of weight in a short amount of time. And what they found was that what triggered her regaining the weight was that an older man inappropriately propositioned her, which triggered her connection to her childhood trauma of her grandfather being inappropriate with her. Then another patient expressed the same thing. And so they went to study, okay, that obesity, which is also what we know now, very strongly linked to childhood sexual abuse, acts as a protective mechanism to protect the victim from more abuse, right? It acts as a physical barrier, as an emotional and mental barrier. There's a lot of things we do with obese people, and so that are not okay, but that's what the research showed. So they began to develop this 10-point questionnaire, right? There were 10 questions, and in fact, if you come see me in therapy, I have most every patient fills it out. And they ask 10 questions, and they're about things like, were your parents loving and available to you? Did you experience a divorce? Was there substance use in the parents? Were the parents violent towards you or someone else in the family? The problem is there's a point for each question, but you don't get multiple points. For example, let's say you had 2 parents who were alcoholics. You just get 1 point for alcohol. That's it. Let's say you had a parent who got divorced 3 times. You just get 1 point for divorce. So that's what I was saying in the beginning. It's often highly underestimated what was really going on. But these 10 questions, and also these 10 questions, I don't think really get to the nuances. They can often seem extreme. And so we can miss people's trauma if we just assume that these 10 questions mean they've had no childhood trauma. So it's really important for you in therapy and therapists to do a much deeper assessment, and I would say most of us do, but especially, around trauma, you'd be surprised what counts as traumatic. And I discussed that in this video. I'm going to make another video a little more in detail about what really is trauma, what is a traumatic childhood, but that's important to know. So as a result of this, these self-reports, these were self-report, meaning they were filled out by the patients themselves, really being asked questions they had never been asked before. They came up with 3 separate categories, right? So you have a possible score of 10 points. Now here's what we found. I'll go into detail in a second, but only 1 out of 3 people had no score. 1 out of 9 had exposure to 5 or more categories. 2 out of 3 had at least 1 category. Women were 50% more likely than men to have an ACE score of 5 or more. If there was 1 ACE score present, there was an 87% chance at least 1 more was present, and 50% chance at least 3 categories were present. So the categories, as I said, weren't given multiple points. They were divided up between abuse, household dysfunction, and neglect. So when we talk about what is abuse, we have psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and physical abuse. So there was 11% psychological, 28% physical, and 22% sexual. Household dysfunction really encompassed alcoholism or drug use. That was 27%. Loss of a biological parent for the child when the child was under the age of 18 was 23%. And as I said in this video, it's actually worse if a parent commits suicide or abandons you than if they, let's say, die in a car accident, because there's some implication there of choice, which we know doesn't necessarily mean that's true with mental health issues. But in terms of the impact on a child, those things are worse and harder to recover from. Depression or mental illness in the home, this includes like borderline narcissism, PTSD, things like that. Mother treated violently, 13%. And having a household member who was incarcerated, 6%. And then neglect was split between physical neglect and emotional neglect. Remember, emotional neglect is about what you don't do, what you don't provide. So the bottom line is that many of our most common and irretractable health issues are actually attempted solutions at problems and traumatic childhood events and shame and secrecy and taboo because we don't talk about them. So what does that mean? That means that if I had a traumatic experience in childhood. I'm more likely to smoke cigarettes. I'm more likely to drink. And so it's really easy to say, well, the smoking, the cigarettes caused the cancer. But what about the idea that in many cases, the initial reasons we start engaging in healthy behaviors might be attempts to solve problems that we have no ability to solve on our own. And most of those things, substances, food, overeating, drinking, they work in the moment. They work for anxiety. They work for depression, right? They work for numbing trauma at times. But we may be really missing out on the root cause and core of why we do these things in the first place. These are the brains of 2 3-year-old children. The image on the left is from a healthy child, while the image on the right is from a child who was in a Romanian orphanage, who was the victim of sensory deprivation and a lot of other horrible things. And you can see that the right brain is smaller and has enlarged ventricles, and which are like those holes you can see in the center of the brain. And it also shows a shrunken cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. So there's lots of research about how the brain is affected by trauma, the growing brain. And so there's lots of research about how trauma affects a developing brain. And the 4 ways that happens is through hormone changes, immune system changes, neurological changes, and epigenetic changes. And really what we're saying here is that in terms of the hormones, when you're living in fight or flight, you're getting a lot of cortisol and adrenaline, and those things are being directed to help you survive, let's say running from a bear. But the bottom line is that these hormone changes affect our developing brain because we start living in this fight or flight, and our brain starts to adapt to that all of the time. And it actually has an impact on our blood pressure, which weakens our heart and circulatory system, keeps our glucose levels elevated, which can lead to type 2 diabetes, disrupts our immune system and inflammatory responses, which can lead to lupus, multiple sclerosis, osteoporosis, abdominal obesity and depression, and reduce our ability to fight infections. And so hormone level changes early in life, when brain development is most rapid, can have a drastic impact on brain architecture and function, as well as other organs, creating really lifelong mental and physical health issues. The next one is immune system changes. Through multiple organs, tissues, and cells, the immune system defends against infections, allergies, and inflammatory reactions. Trauma is linked to thymus involution, atrophy of the spleen and lymph nodes, telomere shortening, and increased stress hormones, which impair immunity and increase inflammation. Impaired immunity and inflammation increase risk for cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, anxiety, depression, viral infections, autoimmune diseases, allergies, and asthma. Now, what about neurological changes? So we are born with about 100 billion neurons. These are our brain nerve cells. And these are almost all of the neurons we will ever have. The connections between the neurons develop vision, hearing, language, and other higher cognitive functions. So, the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can reduce neural connections in the thinking area of the brain, dedicated to learning and reasoning, thus limiting cognitive ability. Continuous trauma can weaken remaining neural pathways to the thinking part of your brain and strengthen neural pathways to the survival part of your brain, thus bypassing the thinking part, which makes some children less capable of coping with adversity as they grow up. Lastly, we see epigenetic changes. And epigenetics is really the study of how your environment and experiences can alter which genes turn off and on. And this is really known as gene modification. So for example, you might be born with, let's say, the genes to be tall, but as a result of malnourishment, trauma, things like that, it can affect that gene's ability to play out the way it was initially supposed to. And so your height, can be affected. There are all kinds of issues. This is just an example. Another example is that, we can affect our risk of developing certain diseases. So turning off and on certain risk factors that may not have been turned off and on, meaning terms of our genetics, had it not been for this traumatic exposure. So trauma can induce epigenetic changes for genes related to mental health, obesity, drug addiction, immune function, metabolic disease, and heart disease. Now, if you look at this pyramid, this is from the typical ACEs study. Here's what really happens in childhood. we have these, as you see at the bottom, adverse childhood events. We have these things that happen to us, right? Then that impacts how our brains work, our emotions work, our social functioning. All of that is then impacted as a result of that early trauma. As a result of that, as we mature, we engage in potentially riskier behaviors, smoking, drinking, more sexual partners, things like that. And that then affects our disease risk and exposure and acquisition of disease, our disability and social problems. Like I was saying, if more of us are on disability because of trauma related to what we ended up doing to ourselves, or we're just sick more, we have, lupus or cancer, it's going to affect all of us. And that lastly leads to early death, right? That's the top of the pyramid. And so if you look at really the summary here that I've made, we have these adverse childhood events in the center. And then we have these negative outcomes. And what are the negative outcomes? They are everything from your opportunities in life, around education, occupations, and access, and your income, to your risk for more injuries around traumatic brain injury, fractures, and even burns. Things like your mental health, including depression, anxiety, suicide, borderline, narcissism, all of those, PTSD, CPTSD. Maternal health is also impacted. We have more unintended pregnancies, more complications, and more fetal death. We have a high risk of infectious disease around HIV and STDs. We have more chronic disease as a result of our childhood trauma, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, gastro issues, obesity, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, right? Chronic disease like lupus, RA, all of those. And more risky behaviors, alcoholism, substance abuse, unsafe sex, and an increased risk for having over 50 partners is also tied to having more trauma in childhood. And so the bottom line is that the higher the ACEs score, the more likely you were to smoke more, drink more, have more health risk, have more mental health risk. You have a higher risk of rape, being a victim of rape, a higher risk of taking antidepressants and drug use and being an injected drug user. It just goes on and on. And so there's a profound link between what happens to us in childhood. And so for those of us who have a 0 score, we truly do have less risk factors for these things. And we actually have less disease. And those with an ACE score of 4 or more, the majority of those adults either have the risk factors for the disease or already have the diseases that I've been talking about or the issues I've been talking about. So really the bottom line is that these ACEs events determine the likelihood of the 10 most common causes of death in the US. Everything from smoking, severe obesity, physical inactivity, depression, suicide attempts, alcoholism, illicit drug use, injected drug use, having over 50 plus partners, and STDs. And so that's a lot. It's a lot to think about as I keep talking about CPTSD and our childhoods and attachment, how all of those experiences play out over the course of our lifetime. And this is why I often say that I think it's nonsense that we say, well, kids are resilient. Yes and no. They have to survive, and so they do. But kids don't have the language to say, oh, I'm feeling depressed today, or, I don't feel good in my body, and that's going to then lead to something else. So I think we're fooling ourselves sometimes about what really happens to us in childhood and how it plays out. And we're neglecting the root cause of what causes a lot of this. And that's a hard problem to solve. How do we get into people's homes and lives and histories and help them heal? I think it starts with a lot more access to mental health in the first place. There's no book on being a great parent, and there's lots of books, but not for you and your story, what your triggers are. And even those who read books are more likely to be better parents because they're at least trying to get resources. But we know that most people don't do that at times. And so it really is important, I think, to think about your own health issues. Also, because if you're struggling and you feel like, is this all in my head? What's wrong with me? There's probably a very direct link between what happened to you in childhood and what's happening for you now. And it's not about blaming everyone's parents, but it's important to at least understand and acknowledge in yourself so you can then figure out how to work on healing your life. So I'll leave this last final insight card posted about ACEs, but I think it's important that we keep talking about it because there's so much more we can do to help people. So I hope you found this helpful. There are so many great resources. There's a lot more research on this issue, but I want you to know that there is true, profound, important research that connects what happens to you in childhood and what's happening to you today in everything from your health and relationships and well-being to your mental health. So thanks for watching. Please stay safe and well, and please don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. That way you'll be notified when I post new videos. And I thank you guys for watching so much. Please take good care, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.